When the elderly woman asked for a seat, the young man with expensive headphones just smirked and said that his father was a powerful man. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from and what you would have done in that situation. The late morning sun hung lazily above the city, casting soft yellow reflections over the glass panels of the bus stop. Cars passed in a steady rhythm, their engines humming like a familiar urban lullaby. People waited in a loose line, some shifting from foot to foot, some studying the timetable, others lost in quiet thoughts. The weather was warm enough for jackets to be unbuttoned, yet cool enough for people to feel grateful for the slight breeze brushing along the pavement. Among them stood a man who didn't look particularly different from anyone else. He wore a simple, well-fitted denim shirt, sleeves slightly rolled, in a pair of jeans that had seen some miles but were still in good condition. His boots were worn, not because he lacked a better pair, but because they had traveled with him long enough to become reliable companions. His posture was calm, steady, not slouched the way hurried or tired people often stood. He looked like someone who had never once rushed in his life, someone who knew where he was going long before he ever stepped outside. Yet no one around him reacted to him in any special way. They didn't turn, didn't whisper, didn't recognize him, and that was exactly how he preferred it. It was Chuck Norris, not the Chuck Norris from internet jokes, not the movie star whose roundhouse kicks lived in pop culture immortality, but a man who was deliberately blending into the anonymity of everyday life. He held no sunglasses, no security detail, no entourage, just a folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket, a watch he checked from time to time, and a stillness in his eyes that belonged to someone who saw more than most people ever would. When the bus pulled up with a hiss of brakes and a brief burst of diesel-scented air, people began boarding with the quiet shuffle of routine. Chuck stepped on in silence, validating his ticket without a word, then walked halfway down the aisle and took a seat near the window. He placed one arm on the rest, just naturally enough not to draw attention. The bus interior had the familiar texture of public transportation, slightly faded seat fabric, smudged glass, the faint citrus scent of cleaning chemicals still lingering on the metal poles. A recorded voice announced the route, its monotone cadence cutting through the murmur of passengers finding their places. He settled in, letting his eyes travel without urgency. Across the aisle sat a college student in headphones, sketchbook open on his lap. A middle-aged office worker typed hurriedly on a phone, thumbs moving with the silent panic of an approaching deadline. A little boy in a dinosaur shirt swung his legs while his mother tried to balance 3 shopping bags and a juice box. In the very back, a construction worker in a reflective vest leaned his head against the window, already half asleep, lulled by motion. Chuck didn't interact, didn't claim presence. He observed, not as a celebrity scanning for fans, not as a fighter sizing up a battleground, but as a man who still believed the world revealed itself in the small things: posture, silence, impatience, kindness. His expression didn't change when the student accidentally dropped a pencil, or when the little boy nearly spilled juice, or when the office worker sighed with the exhaustion of a life lived inside screens. He simply noticed. The bus rolled on, taking corners with the usual sway that forced everyone to adjust their balance. A minor disagreement broke out near the front when a passenger complained about the volume of someone's video. The voices didn't rise into a fight. They dissolved in irritation and silence, as so many public conflicts do, half begun, never resolved. Chuck remained still, showing no intention of inserting himself into anything that wasn't necessary. He knew restraint was a form of strength, too, and most problems didn't need fists or force-only time. Outside the window, the city passed in fragments: a bakery with customers in line, a small park where 2 children chased pigeons, a billboard peeling at the corner, its old advertisement exposing a faded layer beneath it. Every scene was ordinary, yet the world seemed to breathe with understated stories. Chuck reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, not hurriedly, but with a simple gesture of intent. He removed a folded paper, carefully, almost respectfully, and looked at it for a moment. It was not a letter, not a ticket, not a memo. It was an invitation. The words were formal, printed in serif lettering, addressed to him by name. The event was scheduled for today, and the location matched the route the bus was taking. A small emblem in the corner of the paper of metal, encircled by laurel, gave meaning to everything else. He ran his thumb over the raised design as if confirming it was real, then folded it and returned it to his pocket. He checked the time again. He was not late. If anything, he had allowed himself more time than necessary. But this wasn't a day for rushing. It was a day for showing up. The bus continued on, stopping every few blocks to let passengers on and off. Life stayed in motion. A young woman boarded carrying a guitar case. A courier entered, speaking briefly into an earpiece as he scanned his tracking app. Each new arrival brought fresh energy, fresh impatience, fresh distraction. The world did not slow for anyone, but the air shifted when the bus reached the next stop. Through the glass, Chuck noticed her even before she stepped onto the bus, a small elderly woman, holding 2 heavy grocery bags and a worn-out leather purse pressed to her chest as if it contained something fragile. Her steps were steady but slow, each one deliberate. She did not appear helpless, only tired in a way that age and memory make visible. Her hair, silvered but neatly pinned, caught the sunlight in a soft halo. She paused at the curb, waiting for the doors to open, and the driver, without impatience, gave her the few extra seconds she needed. When she finally climbed the steps, the change inside the bus was subtle, but real. Some people lifted their eyes. Others pretended not to see. The student lowered his pencil. The mother moved her bags aside. The construction worker stirred from his half-sleep. Chuck's gaze softened, not with sorrow, but with recognition. There was something familiar about the way she carried herself, something deeper than age or fragility, something that didn't yet reveal itself, but tugged gently at the back of his thoughts. She moved down the aisle slowly, looking for a seat, a place to rest before the bus lurched again. Her breathing grew slightly heavier, the bag straining her arms. But she didn't ask for help. She didn't complain. She simply searched for somewhere to sit, and there was still one empty seat available. At least there should have been. The boy occupying it, young, confident, lost inside his expensive headphones, had stretched his legs across not only his own seat, but the one beside him. His feet, in spotless sneakers, were planted casually where she would have sat. The music pulsed loud enough for people nearby to hear, a deep bass thumping as though trying to claim the space around him. He didn't look up, didn't move, didn't even seem aware that someone might need the seat at all. The old woman stopped beside him and waited. Just waited. Not demanding, simply hoping the world still worked the way it used to, where age meant respect, and kindness was instinctive. Her pause was long, and the silence around it even longer. Chuck watched her knuckles tighten around the grocery bags. He watched the students glance, the office worker frown, the mother whisper to her son to stay seated and don't stare. He watched the boy with the headphones remain untouched by any of it, sealed inside a world of noise and indifference. And as the bus pulled back into motion, tilting just enough to make the woman grab the nearest pole for balance, Chuck felt a stillness settle through him, like the quiet before a storm he already understood. The story had not yet begun, but the moment that would start, it had arrived. And the bus kept moving. The bus continued its steady rhythm along the road, its engine humming beneath the murmurs of passengers and the rattling of loose window frames. The elderly woman, still gripping the metal pole for balance, looked at the seat that should have been free, the one occupied not by a person, but by a pair of expensive shoes carelessly claiming space. The young man they belonged to leaned back comfortably, his head bobbing slightly to the bass of whatever music filled his headphones. He was dressed in designer streetwear, a glossy jacket with a gold emblem on the sleeve, a brand logo stretched across his chest, a smartwatch glowing on his wrist. Everything about him announced money, youth, and a practiced disregard for the world around him. The woman, still breathing a little harder than before, did not scold him, did not protest. She simply waited, as if hoping time itself might correct the imbalance. She spoke quietly, her voice soft, so soft that even those who heard it could pretend they hadn't. "Excuse me, young man, may I sit there?" It was almost a question from another era, where age held natural authority and politeness was met with politeness, but the boy did not hear her. Or pretended not to. The music was loud enough that even a few seats away, people could make out the beat, the sharp digital rhythm that clashed with the quiet discomfort spreading through the bus. The old woman stood in silence, waiting for an answer that wasn't coming. Passengers glanced at her, then away again. Some exchanged looks that said, "Someone should do something," but were grateful not to be that someone. A man in a suit sitting behind the boy cleared his throat loudly. Nothing. A teenager farther back rolled his eyes but stayed glued to his phone. A woman near the front whispered to her friend, "Kids these days," but didn't raise her voice. Everyone saw. No one acted. The young man's heel bounced slightly with the beat, his shoe creasing the seat where the old woman should have already been resting. He was not malicious, just utterly detached, rooted in a reality where his convenience outweighed anyone else's need. His bubble of music, money, and entitlement was thick enough that an entire bus might not have existed at all, except as background scenery. The bus jolted over a rough patch of road, and the elderly woman tightened her grip on the pole, her arms shaking under the strain of holding both the bags and her balance. One of the bags knocked lightly against her leg, and she steadied it with effort. The movement drew the attention of the medics in blue scrubs seated a few rows away. The woman's face had paled. Her breathing had grown shallow, but still she did not complain. Still, she did not push her way into the seat she needed. Chuck watched from his place by the window. His gaze was calm, but not idle. He saw the way her shoulders strained, the subtle way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the tremor in her fingers that had nothing to do with the shaking bus. And he saw the way the passengers reacted, or rather didn't. It wasn't cruelty, not outright. It was something quieter and far more common, the hope that someone else would handle the problem. The woman tried once more, slightly louder this time, but still gentle. "Young man, could you please move your feet? I would like to sit." The boy didn't answer. He didn't even look at her, but he did hear her. His fingers tapped on the armrest in irritation, as if her presence, not her voice, not her request, but her existence interfered with his moment. Then, without removing his headphones, he turned his head just enough to show her he was aware of her, and then dismissed her with a lazy, disrespectful glance before refocusing on his screen. The music volume went up. That was his answer. A woman sitting across the aisle shook her head. "Unbelievable," she whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. "He's taking up 2 seats and sees nothing wrong with it." The man in the suit leaned forward this time, speaking aloud. "Hey, kid, let the lady sit." There was nothing aggressive in his tone, just the expectation that common sense was enough. The boy smirked without looking away from his phone. "Paid full fare," he said loudly, as though that settled everything. He did not remove his feet. His tone carried the lazy arrogance of someone used to getting the last word. Someone sure the world was built to bend for him. "That seat isn't yours," the man insisted. The boy shrugged. "It is if I paid for space. I'm not the one with a discount ticket. I pay taxes. I pay full fare. So yeah, I'll sit how I want." His words were loud enough to spread across the bus, and the way he said them, directed not at the woman, but at the audience, made it clear his defiance was a performance, not just a refusal. The old woman lowered her gaze, not humiliated, but deeply tired. The kind of tired that was heavier than physical exhaustion. The kind that came from understanding, too many times, how the world had changed. Some passengers looked away. Some looked at Chuck, though they didn't know why. Perhaps they sensed something steady in his silence. Perhaps they just wanted someone to take responsibility so they wouldn't have to. The bus driver glanced in the rear mirror, saw the situation, and quickly looked away. Trouble wasn't worth the paperwork the supervisor calls, the inevitable argument with an angry parent threatening to sue the transit system. Better to keep driving. The medics whispered something to each other. One of them stood, approached the old woman, and gently took her elbow. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need to sit?" She managed a thin smile. "I will be fine. Just a little tired." Her voice trembled, a tremor she clearly didn't want anyone to notice. "That's not a little tired," the medic said, frowning. "You're pale. Let's get you seated." But there was still only one available seat, the one with the shoes in it. The young man looked up for the first time then, only to respond to the medic's tone. He removed one earphone, smirk still plastered across his face, and said, "Look, I paid for this seat. I'm not moving just because someone's old. Not my problem." The bus grew still. That sentence, "Not my problem," spread through the air like smoke from a match just struck. Chuck felt the shift. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was the moment before anger, the moment when something no longer felt like a misunderstanding, no longer an accident or lapse in manners. It was deliberate. It was chosen. And that choice had weight. The medic wasn't intimidated. "You're a grown young man. Let her sit." The reply came like a smirk dipped in poison. "I'm not moving just because someone has a wrinkled face. Maybe she should have stayed home if she can't stand." Gasps broke out then, not many but enough to turn silence into judgment. Conversation stopped. Even the child with the juice box paused, sensing something was wrong. The boy leaned back and added, "And before you start preaching, my dad pays more in taxes in a week than all of you do in a year. That's why I don't have to take orders from anyone here." That was when Chuck finally moved. Not suddenly, not in threat, just shifted slightly forward in his seat, his boots planting solidly on the floor. His breathing remained slow, his eyes unchanged. But the passengers who had watched him, unsure of why, now understood. Something was coming. The elderly woman closed her eyes for a moment. Her fingers slipped from the metal pole. Her body swayed slightly before she caught herself again. And for the first time since she boarded the bus, she looked afraid. Not of the boy, not of the seat, but of her own weakening strength. The medic steadied her with both hands. The boy didn't even bother to turn his head. That was the moment the balance in the bus finished tipping. The disrespect wasn't just impolite anymore. It had turned into something else, a quiet cruelty, a public humiliation, a test of what people would allow to happen in front of them. Chuck stood, not abruptly, not dramatically. He simply rose, one hand bracing on the seat. Posture grounded, presence suddenly unmistakable. Not because he spoke, but because the room felt him before he did anything at all. The bus went still again. The boy didn't notice. Not yet, but he was about to. And the conflict, now fully alive, had only just begun. Chuck did not speak right away. He stood there long enough for the silence to thicken, long enough for every passenger who had stayed quiet to suddenly feel the weight of their own stillness. The elderly woman, still supported by the medic, looked up in surprise at the man who had risen, not with aggression, not with impatience, but with a calm purpose that didn't need to be announced. There was no theatrical gesture, no demand for attention, yet the shift in the bus was undeniable. People straightened, eyes widened. Even the hum of the engine felt quieter. The young man with the headphones didn't notice at first. He was too invested in scrolling through notifications and adjusting the volume so the beat thumped against the seats like a heartbeat of entitlement. He only looked up when a shadow fell across his screen. His expression changed, not to fear, but to annoyance, the kind that belonged to someone used to treating inconvenience as an insult. He pulled out one earbud and gave Chuck a dismissive once-over. The smirk returned like a reflex. "What? You want something, old man?" The words landed in the silent bus with a sickening clarity. The students, the office worker, the mother with the child, the construction worker, every one of them braced now, waiting for the moment to break open. But Chuck didn't react to the insult, not outwardly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't invade the boy's personal space. He didn't even look offended. That only made the moment more unsettling, not for Chuck, but for everyone watching. "You need to move your feet." The man in the suit behind the boy spoke again, this time quieter, almost respectfully, as if he knew the center of gravity had shifted away from him and toward the standing man. The boy leaned back, crossing his arms. "See, this is what I mean. People think they can tell me what to do just because they don't like how I'm sitting. You're all acting like I'm a criminal just because I'm comfortable." He spread his arms wide, inviting agreement, hoping for backup. But no one responded. It was the first time since he'd spoken that the silence wasn't avoiding confrontation, it was choosing sides. He noticed, and it irritated him. He glanced back at Chuck. "You going to lecture me too? What, you want the seat? Didn't think you were that old yet." He pointed down at the space beside him as if offering a joke only he found funny. Chuck didn't respond. The boy's confidence flickered, but he pushed through it. "Or what? You think I should stand up for Granny over there? Please, she probably doesn't even pay full fare. Why should I give up what I paid for just because she's fragile? Not my fault she didn't plan ahead. The medic turned sharply toward him, anger finally audible. She doesn't need a lecture. She needs a seat. She's close to fainting. Do you understand that? The boy waved her off like an annoying fly. Not my problem. If she's that weak, maybe she shouldn't be on a bus. There it was again. Not my problem. And this time the words met no approval, no laughter, no indifference. The passengers who had spent minutes pretending to be uninvolved now watched in stillness, not because they didn't care, but because they knew something was coming, something inevitable. The balance had already broken. Chuck's voice finally entered the conversation, low and calm. She asked you politely. You chose to ignore her. Now she needs help, and you're still choosing to ignore her. The young man straightened a little in his seat, the arrogance in his expression now fused with confusion, because the tone Chuck used was not angry, not desperate. It was simply final. Look, the boy said, the first tremor of defensiveness in his voice. You don't get to tell me what to do. You don't know who I am. His fingers lifted his phone, screen turned outward as if displaying proof of status. A background image, a photo of him standing beside an older man in a suit. Flashes of wealth, events, privilege. That was how he justified himself by association, not action. My dad could buy this whole bus line. He could ruin every single one of you with a phone call. So unless you want a lawsuit or an apology tour, back off. Some passengers flinched, not because they feared him, but because they recognized the threat. They had heard that tone before, from bosses, from officials, from men who hid behind bigger men. Power without character, weaponized through ego. Chuck didn't flinch. Your father's not here, he said simply. The boy blinked, not expecting that answer. Then his jaw tightened. Yeah, but he will be. And when he hears how a bunch of nobody passengers tried to tell me what to do, you'll see how fast this turns around. The medic tried again. You need to move your feet so she can sit before she gets worse. That's all anyone is asking. But the boy was locked in now, his pride swelling like a balloon made too thin. No, I paid like everyone else and I'm not giving anything up. If she can't stand, that's her problem, not mine. The bus lurched over a pothole. The woman's knees buckled. The medic caught her fully this time. Murmurs rippled across the aisle. Someone swore under their breath. Someone else muttered, unbelievable. The man in the suit sank back into his seat, defeated. A teenage girl closed her eyes, wishing she could disappear. The tension inside the bus had become suffocating, the kind that made people feel smaller just for being present. It was no longer about the seat. It was about the choice. The young man, legs still sprawled across the cushion, finally looked at Chuck as if realizing the calm presence beside him hadn't moved, hadn't backed down, hadn't budged. His smirk twisted into something harder, more animal. What are you staring at, old man? You think you can make me move? You think I care what you want? He pushed himself forward, getting ready to stand, shoulders squaring, chest puffing out as if preparing to prove something, anything to restore control he felt slipping. The medic stepped back. The mother pulled her child closer. The teenager froze with his sketchbook in midair. Even the bus driver staring through the rear mirror seemed to brace. The young man rose to his feet, chin tilted, eyes filled with manufactured rage built on ego, not strength. You don't get to talk to me like that, he spat. You don't know who my father is. Chuck took one step forward. I don't need to know your father, he said quietly. The boy scoffed and with a reckless burst of confidence shoved Chuck hard in the chest. That was the moment the tension stopped rising and instead snapped like a wire stretched too far. The conflict was no longer just words. It had crossed into action, and now there was no going back. The shove came fast, careless, and full of the kind of confidence born from never having faced real consequences. The young man expected the impact to send Chuck stumbling backward, maybe crashing into a seat, maybe finally reacting the way most people did when confronted by sudden force, defensively, shakily, apologetically. That was what he was used to. Push, intimidate, dominate. It was a formula that had worked for him in schools, in stores, in clubs, in every space where authority hesitated and people chose silence over conflict. But Chuck did not stumble. His body absorbed the shove the way a stone absorbs wind, without movement, without alarm, without even a flicker of imbalance. The boy's hand, still pressed against Chuck's chest, suddenly looked small, absurdly small, like someone placing their palm against a mountain expecting it to move. The boy blinked. The rest of the bus went utterly still. Chuck did not respond with a shove of his own. He did not clench his fists or flare with anger. He simply took the hand that had pushed him and lowered it gently, not forcefully, not painfully, but with a grip so controlled that the young man's arm fell without resistance, as if guided by gravity instead of strength. "You should sit down," Chuck said quietly. The words were not a threat, not loud, not dramatic, but something in them, tone, weight, certainty cut deeper than any shouting could have. It wasn't what he said. It was what it meant. It meant the situation had already changed, and the boy was the last one to realize it. For a second, the young man hesitated. A fraction of instinct inside him understood that something was wrong, that this wasn't like arguing with a cashier or mocking a teacher or filming himself provoking strangers for online views. But pride was a stronger force than intuition, and the eyes of the bus were on him. He couldn't back down. Not now. Not with everyone watching. Not with silence hanging like judgment in the air. He shoved again harder this time, angrier, trying to force the outcome he wanted. This time, Chuck moved, but not backward, sideways. With a small, effortless shift of weight, he let the force of the boy's own shove work against him. The young man stumbled past him, thrown off balance not by impact but by the absence of resistance. Chuck guided his shoulder, redirected the momentum, and the boy crashed sideways into the pole near the seats. His phone slipped from his hand, clattering against the floor and skidding beneath a row of shoes. His headphones flew off, their music silenced mid-beat. Gasps erupted around the bus, not screams, not panic, just that sharp communal intake of breath when reality changes shape in front of people. The boy spun around, embarrassed anger flaring. "You don't touch me. You don't get to—" He lunged, wildly, without technique, all instinct, no discipline. Chuck stepped aside and caught him not with a punch, not with a kick, but with precision. One hand redirected the boy's wrist, the other controlled his elbow, turning his impulsive attack into his own trap. The young man's knees buckled as his balance was taken from him, and before he even understood what had happened, he was guided down, not slammed, not thrown, but placed into a position where movement only brought more discomfort. It was not a fight. It was the end of one. Chuck knelt beside him, calm as ever, applying the slightest necessary pressure to keep the boy from rising. His hold wasn't violent, but immovable, controlled with the ease of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering force instead of flaunting it. The young man writhed in humiliation rather than pain. "Let me go! Get off me! I swear, you don't know who you're messing with. I'll have you arrested. I'll have you sued." Chuck looked him in the eye, not with fury, but with the kind of steady disappointment only truth can hold. "You already messed with the wrong person," he said, "and it wasn't me." The boy stopped struggling, confused, thrown, unable to understand the meaning behind the words. But everyone else in the bus did. Every pair of eyes turned not to the fallen boy, but to the elderly woman still clutching her grocery bags, held upright by the medic's hands. She was breathing more steadily now, but the exhaustion etched in her posture was the heart of everything that had happened. Chuck released the boy only when he stopped fighting, only when the struggle was replaced by something closer to shock. He stood up, not with triumph, not with victory, but with purpose. Then he turned away from the boy entirely, as if the matter had already ended, as if the boy was no longer worth his attention. He crouched beside the elderly woman instead. "May I help you sit down?" he asked, voice low, respectful, offering his arm without pressure, without presumption. She nodded, still shaken, and he guided her gently into the very seat that had caused all the trouble. The medic adjusted her bags, checked her pulse again, relieved to see color returning to her face. The passengers broke their silence. Not with chatter, not with outrage, but with a low ripple of awe, almost reverence. Some of them clapped softly. Others exhaled as if they had been holding their breath for minutes. A few bowed their heads, ashamed at how long it took for anyone to intervene. The boy, still on the floor, stared up at them all. His face burned, not from injury, but from sudden, overwhelming clarity. He had expected fear or submission. Instead, he found himself beneath the eyes of dozens of people who finally saw him. Not as powerful, not as protected, but as the only person in the bus who had lost something today. Dignity. The bus driver finally stood, stepping into the aisle for the first time, but not to challenge Chuck. His voice cracked slightly. "Everything okay back there?" Chuck looked at him and nodded once. Nothing else needed to be said. The boy reached for his fallen phone, but when he flipped it over, its screen reflected something unexpected. Not his face, not the mess of his pride, but a red blinking dot in the upper corner. The bus's security camera. It had captured everything, and for the first time the boy stopped speaking. He didn't threaten, didn't protest, didn't reach for his speakerphone to call his father, because now there was evidence, and the truth was no longer something he could rewrite. The bus rolled forward again, but the world inside it had changed. Not because a fight had happened, but because a line had been drawn. The kind of line that people remember long after the bus arrives at its final stop. The line between strength and cruelty, between pride and honor, between what someone can get away with and what someone should never do. Chuck returned to his seat silently, but he did not sit the way he had before. His body remained ready, aware. His eyes were not on the boy, but on the woman he had helped. She met his gaze only briefly, but in that glance lived something stronger than gratitude recognition. Not of a celebrity, not of a fighter, but of a man who understood why respect matters. The bus continued toward its destination, but the story was nowhere near over. The bus rolled on in a quieter rhythm than before, not because the engine had softened, but because the mood inside had changed so completely that even the sound of tires over pavement seemed more controlled, more respectful, as if the machine itself understood something had shifted among its passengers. The elderly woman sat at last, breathing in steady, even pulls of air. The medic remained beside her, monitoring her pulse, offering water from a small bottle. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear anymore, but from the slow return of strength. Her bags were arranged neatly at her feet, no longer a burden, but simply quiet reminders of her day. She was safe now, and safety true. Earned safety had a weight to it, the kind that settled in deeper than relief. Chuck returned to his seat and watched her for a moment, ensuring she was stable, that her color continued to return, that the medic was satisfied. Only then did he turn his gaze away, leaning back quietly as though the confrontation had required nothing from him at all. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction, no pride. If anything, he looked like a man who wished the situation hadn't needed him, and that, more than anything, was what separated him from the boy still crouched on the floor. The young man had retrieved his phone. He held it in trembling hands, screen cracked, reflection broken into a web of splintered shapes. It was not the damage that rattled him. It was the blinking red dot of the bus's security camera, recorded clearly in the corner of the reflection, the word wreck glowing like a verdict. He turned his phone over slowly, as if by looking away he could undo what had happened. But the world did not undo itself merely because someone wanted it to. He had always been able to erase his own wrongdoing before delete a message, edit a video, craft a different version of events. But this time the truth wasn't in his hand. It was on a hard drive bolted to the roof of the bus. And that meant he was not the one in control anymore. Passengers noticed him differently now. Not as the loud, entitled boy demanding attention, but as someone who didn't know what to do with silence. The man in the suit no longer argued with him. The teenage girl no longer rolled her eyes. The office worker no longer sighed into his phone. They looked at him with something far worse than anger. They looked at him with disappointment. And disappointment, he now understood, was not a force one could fight. The construction worker leaned in from the back of the bus, eyes narrowed, not in hostility but in the weary awareness of someone who had seen too many young men confuse privilege with character. A mother guided her child's gaze away from the boy, not out of fear, but out of a desire to protect innocence from arrogance. The young man tried to speak twice but failed. The words caught in his throat, not because he was silenced, but because, for the first time in a long time, he had nothing convincing to say. The bus slowed and finally reached its next major stop. Not a street corner, but a hub. Through the window, people could see a broad plaza with a banner stretched across an entrance. A community center, its doors open for an event. Chairs arranged in rows. A table with flowers and framed photographs. A small podium set near a display covered in cloth. The driver turned on the cabin lights and announced the stop. Most of the seated passengers didn't know the destination's purpose, but Chuck did, and so did the elderly woman. The medic gathered the woman's bags, ready to escort her. A volunteer wearing a name badge stepped onto the bus the moment the doors opened, not with the typical impatience of someone managing a schedule, but with concern. She addressed the older woman by name, her expression turning to alarm when she saw how pale she still looked. "We've been waiting for you," the volunteer said, her voice thin with worry. "Are you all right?" "You look faint." The woman nodded, quiet and composed. "Just a little tired. I'll be fine." But the volunteer was already signaling to others at the entrance. 2 more staff members emerged, helping her down the steps while a crowd outside began whispering in recognition. The passengers inside watched, curiosity growing. Some leaned toward the windows. Others stood to see more clearly. They did not understand the significance, but the atmosphere outside made it clear. She was not just a random elderly woman. People were waiting for her. People respected her. People knew her name. The medic stepped off the bus after her, letting the staff take over. Then the volunteer looked back upward and said, "Is Mr. Norris here as well?" A dozen heads turned instantly. Chuck stood, not surprised that they knew his name, only that the timing had arrived. He stepped toward the front, nodding with a quiet familiarity, and left the bus without hurry, without grandness, as though he were simply continuing a path he had already intended to walk. No applause, no cameras, no spotlight. Only recognition, the kind given to someone who had earned it long before today. The boy watched him leave, not with defiance, but with something he'd never expected to feel. Confusion mixed with humility. The man he had mocked, shoved, and threatened, the man he thought was beneath him, was being welcomed outside by people who didn't just know his name, but expected him. The event staff greeted Chuck as though he were not a guest, but part of the reason the event mattered. They shook his hand, gestured toward the entrance, thanked him for coming, and still, he remained unchanged. No smile of ego, no performance of grace, just presence. The boy inside the bus finally understood one thing. Real influence didn't need to be announced. He rose slowly from the floor. Passengers parted instinctively, not out of fear this time, but because no one wanted to stand beside him. Not after what had happened, not after what he had chosen. He picked up his cracked phone, and in the smudged, fractured reflection of the screen, he saw the blinking red light of the bus recording once more. His father couldn't erase that. Not this time. Not with money, not with threats, not with a phone call. The bus driver stepped briefly into the aisle, meeting the boy's eyes. His voice was steady, not unkind. "You'll want to stay seated. Transit security will meet us at the end of the line." And just like that, the boy sat. For the first time in a long time, he sat because he had no power to stand. Outside, Chuck walked beside the elderly woman, not guiding her as a rescuer, but accompanying her as a friend. As they moved farther from the bus, the crowd greeted her not as a tired stranger, but with applause meant for someone whose life had mattered. And now finally it became clear why Chuck had boarded a public bus today. He had not come to rescue her. He had come to honor her. Not because she was old, but because she had lived a life worthy of respect. And the boy in the bus, watching it all unfold through a cracked reflection of himself, was left with the first consequence he had ever truly earned. Silence, and the awareness that the world would not bend for him forever. The bus doors closed, the ride continued, but everything had already changed. The bus pulled away from the curb, its doors closing on the scene outside. But the weight of what had happened lingered inside like a presence no one could shake. The young man remained seated now, not because he wanted to be, but because for the first time in a long while, he had no chosen power-only consequences. The passengers who had once feared confrontation now looked out the windows, witnessing what they could not have imagined at the beginning of this ordinary route. Outside, the elderly woman was welcomed not as a frail passenger, but as an honored guest. The volunteers guided her slowly toward the building, where rows of chairs had been set up beneath banners, displaying dates, photographs, and the silhouettes of medals. Her name was spoken with respect, printed on the program leaflets held by attendees. As she stepped forward, applause rose, not because she had asked for it, but because she had earned it long before this day. And beside her walked Chuck Norris, quiet and steady, neither leading nor following, but accompanying her the way a man does when he knows the world owes her more than a seat on a bus. Their steps matched not in speed, but in purpose. He listened as she thanked the medic. He accepted no praise from those who recognized him. He declined the cameras that tried to follow him. He was not there to be seen. He was there to witness. Inside the community center, the atmosphere was reverent, not somber, but full of a kind of warmth that only appears when gratitude outweighs formality. Stories were shared. Photographs displayed moments of courage, of service, of sacrifice. Moments that belong not to the famous, but to the forgotten. The elderly woman took her seat of honor, hands folded over the purse she had carried so protectively. On her lap lay a metal tarnished but polished at the edges, where fingers had touched it for decades. A speaker at the podium began reading her biography. The kind of life most people never hear about. The kind of life that doesn't make headlines, but shapes the people who do. She had been a teacher, a volunteer during difficult years, a widow who had continued her husband's charitable work long after he was gone. She had changed lives quietly, steadily, without reward, without applause. And somewhere in the listing of dates and accomplishments, a younger Chuck Norris appeared not by name, not by title, but in memory. She had once been a teacher in a program where he had volunteered as a young man, before fame, before films, before the world would turn his name into legend. She had pushed him to keep going when his early efforts meant nothing to anyone but himself. She had told him, respect is not about strength, it's about choosing to use strength for others. She remembered that moment. He had never forgotten it. Now the room applauded as she received the honor she had been brought here for a recognition of a lifetime of service. Not a single brave act, but many small ones, threaded through decades of quiet purpose. Chuck stood to the side, hands folded, head bowed slightly. Not as a celebrity, not as a hero, but as someone who owed a debt of gratitude. Meanwhile, the bus continued toward the end of the line. The young man sat motionless, phone in his hands, but no longer tapping it, no longer planning his defense, no longer sure that anyone would believe him, even if he tried to retell the story his own way. The blinking camera light above him had taken that power out of his hands. His own reflection in the shattered screen seemed to stare back with judgment, as though fractured glass showed the truth more clearly than any mirror ever had. When the bus reached the transit station, security was waiting. Not aggressively, not with handcuffs or commands, but with the calm authority of people who had seen all kinds of behavior and knew exactly how to handle it. They spoke to him quietly. He tried to form excuses at first, murmuring about rights, about influence, about misunderstanding, but his words folded in on themselves, collapsing under the truth that everyone else had seen. He didn't resist, not because he agreed, but because, for the first time, resistance felt hollow. The man in the suit exited the bus with a final glance toward him, not satisfied, not vengeful, but relieved. The teenage girl closed her sketchbook. The mother took her child's hand, whispering instructions about kindness. The construction worker shook his head with a sigh that meant, maybe he'll learn now. And the boy who had once claimed power through inheritance was left with the one thing no one had ever made him face: accountability. Inside the community center, the event continued without spectacle. Speeches ended. Applause faded into quiet conversation. Cups of coffee were poured. Old stories were shared in corners of the room. No one noticed when Chuck began making his way toward the exit, not because he was ignored, but because he had not made himself the center of the moment. The elderly woman stopped him before he reached the doors. She didn't speak immediately. She didn't need to. Her eyes held a memory, a history, and a thank you far deeper than a single moment on a bus. "You always did know the difference," she said finally, her voice faint but firm, "between fighting and protecting." Chuck smiled not broadly, not for show, but with the sincerity of a man who understood that most of life's important lessons are learned in silence. He pressed her hand gently and said, "I only did what I was taught." Outside, the late afternoon light had softened into the warm gold of approaching evening. The plaza was quieter now. The volunteers were gathering chairs, talking among themselves. A banner flapped lightly in the breeze. Chuck walked across the pavement, not as a public figure, not as a legend, but as a man returning to his own life the way he had left it, without fanfare, without audience, without the need for anyone to know where he was going next. Near the bus stop, another bus was boarding. A young man inside, different from the one before, offered his seat to an elderly passenger without hesitation. No cameras recorded it, no cheers followed, but small acts of respect have a way of spreading, even when no one is watching. Chuck glanced at the scene briefly, then continued walking. Not every story ends with punishment. Some end with understanding. Some end with a lesson that takes hold in silence. And some end exactly the way this one did, without applause, without a headline, but with a clear reminder of what real influence looks like. It does not demand respect, it earns it, and it passes it on. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who needs to see it. And don't forget, there are more stories waiting for you. Check out the next video and I'll see you there.